The forming of the human nature when man and his past were very young. The gods had gone, vanished forever, leaving behind the first gentle swell of past that began with them. At this time, when man and his past were very young, nature was the only existing order of things. Nature was the earth's immemorial past, consisting of yesterday's experience in plant, animal, and man, being applied as life today. There was no planning, no future, only action and doing now. The gentle pressure of his own young past kept man finely balanced within his senses. He used the senses in the way nature had evolved them, as receivers, permitting him to stand back within and relish the sounds, smells, sights. Taste and touch of the all-pervading earth. It was a wonderful, simple state of living and being of yesterday and today. Tomorrow never came, but one day, tomorrow did come. Man invented it. The mounting pressure drove man further and further into his senses, away from his inner nature and toward the formal world. Finally, the pressure from within started driving man out of his senses. He began projecting through them into the world. Rising emotions started to appear in his eyes and gestures. His sense of smelling reversed from a soft intake of breath to an often harsh and aimless projection of words. His sense of taste became a missile of opinions, often expressed as violent likes and dislikes. Hearing developed into an emotional extension of his body, alert not for natural sounds, but for intonations of insult and slight. Attachment to his body increased. The further out he projected, the more isolated, vulnerable, and threatened he felt. This in turn made him cling emotionally to his body even more. The earlier fine balance between nature and the senses, his original inner poise, was destroyed. He had extended himself so far that he was now outside of nature. Nature, like himself, had become for him a purely external sense-perceived form, and no longer could provide him with the intimate feeling of oneness with the earth and all life. In his new exposed, externalized position, all he could see in the environment was the threat of death. To survive seemed the only realistic point to living. Yet survival was impossible, as the evidence of each day's dead bodies around him demonstrated. Death, once the most natural event, was now the most terrifying. The fear of dying and losing his body, the last apparent formal link with where he had come from, became obsessional. Tomorrow was his answer. With this one stupendous invention, he could break out of today and create a new world of his own. A world of progress and continuity, an apparent ongoing. A distance between himself and death, the end. Death could now be forgotten. It would come tomorrow, never today. In this way, it became a problem that no longer needed to be confronted. It was the world's first act of ignorance. The truth is immortality. Man's original nature, which he had allowed himself to be driven out of, and any substitute for it is ignorance. By identifying himself with the idea of world progress and improvement, man also unconsciously invented the necessary delusion of hope. Hope is not necessary for today. It arises only in trying to escape from today. In a world where man must die, there can be no hope, apart from the delusive hope that he will not die. Hope is an attempt through ignorance to put off the inevitable. Instead of living naturally for today, man began living unnaturally for tomorrow. This meant projecting himself emotionally into the future, that is, further beyond his senses and the formal world into imagination. The more he looked into the future in his imagination, the more dissatisfied and discontented he was with today. Man reeled from reaction to reaction, every reaction creating a delta of effects. In those days, when the past was young and man was subconsciously looking for an identity to reflect his forgotten immortality, any idea he could identify with became part of the new human nature he was creating for himself. He was still fashioning and ordering the human psyche in its human way of perceiving. Perhaps in retrospect, the forming of human nature, man's substitute nature, may seem to have been a very profound and complex process, but in fact it was no more than the complicated outcome of a very simple and purely psychological device for escaping from emotional pressure. By creating innumerable problems around a supposed future or tomorrow, he was able to keep his mind busy and distracted from having to face up to the one big problem of today: death, the end of any future or imagined tomorrows. This psychotic nature can be seen operating in every man's worries today. To worry today, he has first to assume he is not going to die today. If he were truly aware he was dying or going to die, all his other worries would vanish instantly like the chimeras they are. In those days when his past was young enough to be still recognizable in his perception of the present, man was born as an individual being, that is, born as a baby with his true nature of immortality intact. Under the new order of things, it was essential that this individual be eliminated. If allowed to mature, such self-knowledge of immortality could presumably destroy the delusion of tomorrow, and perhaps even human nature itself, and all the present race of sophisticated and progressive men who depended on the idea of the world where their existence would have to die, or something worse. A remarkable change occurred in the human psyche. Every child from birth would now be immediately and ceaselessly labeled, first by his parents, guardians, and teachers, and later, as he got the idea automatically by himself, and the world he fervently believed in both. Initially, he would be labeled baby, and treated like one, taught to comprehend, think, and react in an infantile fashion, matching the ignorance of his parents and the people around him. The opportunity for them to address intelligently the immortal, unperturbed, and clearly non-conforming individuality in the newborn baby's consciousness would never be seriously taken. The parental duty at birth would be to assume immediately the protective position of the teacher of ignorance and mortality. The whole delusion of tomorrow depends on the hysteria of mass forgetfulness. One must never look at the cause of today's suffering. One must not root out the cause today, but must look to see how it can be removed in the future. In man's world of progress, all individuals are expendable because they have no place in it. All of this, the whole saga of tomorrow and the forming of man's substitute human nature, was the beginning of the process of evolution by involution. Up to the point of self-consciousness in the gods, evolution had been confined to the physical ascent of the species, or the descent of man into matter, his body. The next phase of evolution, involution, was to be the gradual, enforced descent of his self-consciousness into a new body, a world body of progress, his nescient substitute world, which later would form into reasonable knowledge and information, today's intellectual materialism. Paradoxically, due to man's emotional escape into tomorrow, evolution by involution is his only way back to his lost immortality and godhood. Man invented tomorrow and has now to live in it. Involution is the endless complication of life, by man's self-consciousness requiring him to go further away, deeper into the world body of ignorance, falsehood, or imagination, before he can get back out and free of it, as he determined the future when the past was very young is how it must be, except that finally the truth of his immortality and godhood must out. Evolution by involution can be illustrated by the analogy of the wheel, a familiar symbol of time and progress. As the axis of the wheel of evolution moves forward, the wheel itself revolves backwards over old ground.